social capital was an idea that has a long intellectual history, but sort of came into prominence in the late 1990s, essentially. And the way that I spoke about it and the way that I wrote about it was largely to try and help people understand change processes, because development changes who people interact with. It changes the terms on which people interact with. And social science inherently struggles to find precise language in English or any other language for talking about these things, and for reasons that I won't go into, social capital sort of found itself as being a lingua franca, so to speak, for talking about these broad categorizations of issues of how citizens engage with each other, how citizens engage with the state, or with power structures more broadly, and how people deal with people different to them, not just their own immediate kith, kin, neighbors, broader constituencies of people who look different to them, who have different occupations, whose histories and futures are very different. And so how the us-them boundaries were constructed and how those get navigated, those themselves are changed by the development process. Those issues came to the fore in the post-Cold War moment, when walls were removed and suddenly all sorts of new groups were interacting with each other. But even in rich countries here in the United States, the processes of inequality just really drive, again, who you meet, whether you catch public transport and meet different people on the subway every day, or whether you get driven in the backseat of a chauffeur-driven car. You have a very different social world that you live in when you function in those different spaces. So social capital was a language for talking about that. Social cohesion is more of a European idea, but it was largely a societal sort of question, very much sort of the social equivalent of inequality, of economic inequality. So social cohesion was the political pact, or the social contract that bound citizens together and that gave them a common identity as a people. And so they served, the social capital language was more neutral, perhaps, or at least we wanted to be focused more on groups and individuals and the ways in which interactions between particular groups happen. So it was a more micro concept, as it were, whereas the social cohesion was a more macro societal kind of concept that was deployed to talk about how big social transformations in countries unfolded. So when a country like Indonesia or Eastern Europe, when those countries went through very radical and rapid transitions, that was kind of a social cohesion kind of story, because a political contract or a social set of arrangements that had been in existence for long periods of time suddenly changed. We tended to talk about that more in a social cohesion kind of language, because it was a societal issue. Social capital was much more to do with questions of migration, questions of how people use their own social networks to get ahead and to be able to get by. And that was one distinction that was often used in the social capital literature. The friends I have that help me to get by, that I turn to in a crisis, that I would have a heart-to-heart conversation with, or I would turn to if I was desperate and needed money to feed a family. And that turns out to be very relevant, I think, for development questions, because development really changes how people interact with each other. We have common maxims in English that it's not what you know, it's who you know, and it turns out that every language, every cultural group around the world has some variance on that kind of way of talking about things. In Southern Africa, they have a wonderful phrase that I am because we are, right? Ubuntu, a wonderful concept that, the anthropology of this can play itself out in many different ways, but every group has a recognition that I am the person I am because the group is who it is. But development changes all that. It puts people in a very different space. If you are a farmer living in a rural area, you hang out with other farmers. But if new technology comes in and renders half of you redundant because a tractor can now do what you did in a quarter of the time and a quarter of the price, then you move to a city and you've got to interact with a whole bunch of different people and on very different terms, not just in we live together for generations sense. Now I'm living in a teeming slum, or I'm living in a very high energy urban environment where I've got to catch public transport to work, I've got to fill out forms, I've got to deal with government officials, I've got to put my kids in school. All that really changes the kinds of people you interact with. We take that for granted in the West because we've never known any other world other than the one we've grown up with. But for many of the rapidly developing countries of Asia, East Asia in particular, that's a ongoing lived reality of people having migrated from rural areas to urban areas, and having to keep identities in rural areas but still earning livelihoods in an urban context, having to live a split personality almost between a world in which my earning is done in the city, but my reproducing, my family and my elders and my maintenance, my family and my own parents are all still, and my identity, who I think I am, is still very much grounded in the rural circumstances from whence I came. So these are all very important changes that are often occurring sort of at a slower pace than interest rate changes or economic growth, which we can measure and monitor on a very real-time kind of basis. The social world is the air we breathe, and so we tend to be less familiar with it, or at least less conscious of it, until you do actually find yourself a migrant. You do actually find yourself having to live in a different country or function in a different space, and you realize this, what's a constant. It happens all the time, but many people do that without any of the social supports. Many migrants move to countries and don't speak a language. They don't know how to fill out a form. They don't get a bank account. They don't know what the law is in regards to what their rights are. So all of those issues have to get resolved in some way, and historically they get resolved by other people who speak the same way as you and are related to you, or from the same ethnic group as you, and you invest in those people and engage with those people for up to a generation, until your own children then are able to make a transition subsequently. But all that stuff happens in a much slower motion than other economic activity, but it's no less real and no less consequential for that. And all of our writing and thinking about social capital was really about trying to find a language for talking about this that was relatively intuitive, but that also facilitated a very serious but nuanced conversation about the different ways in which the people we interact with changes as a result.